By now we've probably figured out that self-blended learning is a pretty powerful tool. It's a pretty powerful way of equipping people to thrive and survive in this connected world. But there are also some barriers that get in the way, and it's important for us to kind of talk through these. Interestingly, almost all of the barriers, actually all of the barriers I'm going to talk about, they're from within the school. So let's start with the first one, teacher convictions. Teachers don't typically go into education to get wealthy, right? They're not in it for the paycheck. They need a living wage, but most teachers are in the field of education because they care about students and maybe they care about their content and what they're teaching as well. We go through this education system and along the way we develop some convictions about how education is best done. Sometimes that's supported by the research, sometimes it isn't. Whatever the case, self-directed learning can sometimes clash with the convictions of a classroom teacher. It feels really great to be wanted and to be needed by a student. Parents experience the same thing, right? At some point, their children become a little more independent, and the parents have to figure out that balance of when to control and when to hand the control over to their son or their daughter. The same thing happens when we're talking about self-blended learning. And the way through this is for teachers to really kind of reflect and to think about what the end goal is. So if our end goal is really to equip people to become more self-directed, to have this ability to have fish for a lifetime, right? The cliche that we've talked about, give a man a fish, he'll have fish for a day, or teach a man to fish, he'll have fish for a lifetime. If the teacher's goal is really to teach the person to fish, that means stepping back at some point. And so this is really, the only way through it is really for teachers to kind of revisit that and to challenge their own assumptions and their own beliefs and their own convictions and to really test it out. Just try out some self-blended and self-directed learning activities. Create a little bit of space for that to happen and see what goes on. Monitor the progress. See what works, see what doesn't work. But you can't give up after the first attempt because hardly any of us get things right the first time we try it. Could you imagine learning to play the piano or some instrument and you sit down and you go to play your favorite song and you can't do it? So do you stare at the piano and say, this is a stupid machine, it doesn't work? Or do you realize that learning to play music on the piano takes practice and takes time? That's the same thing when it comes to self-blended and self-directed learning. This is something that teachers can't assume that that'll work perfectly overnight. It's something they'll have to work on. They'll have to challenge their own assumptions, stretch themselves to step outside their comfort zone, and to test some things and to experiment and to invite the kids into the experiment. Try this out, see what works, see what doesn't work, try it again, refine it over time. Another thing that is a common barrier is the students. So students have grown up in a largely directed school environment. They're waiting for the teacher to tell them what to do, when to do it, how to do it. And students can really struggle, and they can get frustrated, and they can even make comments that go right to the heart of the teacher, like claiming that they're not doing their job if they're not directing the student more. Now, self-blended and self-directed learning is not about the teacher just going and sitting down on their desk and letting students do whatever they want. It takes a ton of planning, a ton of mentoring, a ton of modeling. They're very engaged with the students, but in a different way. So for students, this is going to take some work. The teacher has to invite the students to see what it looks like to be self-blended and self-directed, to help them see why this is an important goal, an important skill for them to develop in their lives, and then to be a mentor and a guide along the way and a coach, and to not give up the moment that students feel like this is too much. It's new. Back to the piano analogy I gave before. We can't put students in front of a piano and expect them to be able to play something perfectly the first time. And the reality is, if you have a classroom of students learning to play the piano, each one is going to learn at a different pace and they'll have different needs. And the same thing is going to be true for self-directed learners. Some students will embrace it right away. Others will struggle for quite a while, and you'll have to coach and guide them and maybe support them a little bit more than other students. Some students will be really resistant all the way to the end. And to tell the truth, as I've visited self-directed learning schools and contexts, there are occasions where a student just decides this isn't for me, and they decide they need to find a different kind of school or context. But most of the time, if there's strong teacher support, if the teacher is really helping to communicate the vision and the why behind self-blended learning, and they're doing that mentoring and coaching with the students, that is a barrier that can be overcome. And when it is such a joy for both the student and the teacher. Now there's some other players here, obviously, as well. What about the parents? In fact, as I've looked at schools that have embraced self-blended and self-directed learning a little bit more, parents can sometimes be the most adamant. This is really difficult because this is not what most parents remember of school. It's not consistent with their own experiences. And they don't know how to assess how their children are doing. Are they making progress or are they not? So one of the key ways to overcome this barrier is frequent and meaningful communication with the parents. And it starts before you even try your first self-blended or self-directed learning exercises in the classroom or in the school. It's sharing with them again, what is it, what it isn't, what are the myths about it. It's coming up with a clear vision of sort of what you're going to be doing and how parents can be supportive of their children in this new environment. And also finding a way to answer the question before it's asked. How will I know when my student is making progress or not? That's why it's really great when you're embracing self-blended and self-directed learning to consider doing something like a learning contract, where you work out with each student what they're going to learn, how they're going to learn it, how they're going to track their progress, and you create timelines, check-ins basically. Some are even daily to start out, or weekly check-ins to check with the students, and those reports can be shared with the parents. When you work through the common barriers with teachers and students and parents, this can be a pretty powerful tool. It can really be transformational in classrooms. Now there is another barrier, and that has to do with leadership, both board leadership and school leaders. And to tell the truth, if you don't have the school leaders, especially a superintendent or the principals, if you don't have them on board with this vision, it's hard to make a lot of progress, even in a standalone classroom. It's important to have this conversation with school leaders and to explain to them again why you want to pursue this and what you're going to do and what challenges might pop up, and help them to be proactive and to prepare for those. And to know essentially that they have your back, that they're going to support you, that they share this vision and they think it's important for kids as well. And they're going to be there. Maybe they're not going to give you a ton of resources, but they're going to give you the freedom and the support to experiment and to try this out in your classroom. That's about it. Most of the major barriers are people and their past experience and their convictions. And as we've already explored in this course, there are so many powerful reasons to consider embracing self-blended and self-directed learning. We can work through these relationship challenges, and when we do, it's a win, 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 win.